I will say that most of what I'm going to say today is intended for the evangelical church, and more specifically, the white evangelical church in America. Because again, that's the world I come from. That's the world I know. That's the world I left. And I am going to say some things that are difficult to hear if you are in the white evangelical church. And again, I do not say any of this to be to get back at anybody for saying anything about me. Again, I'm grateful for the criticism that I received. I am pre-grateful for the criticism I will receive for this, because
pre-grateful.
It continues to make me a person who cares less about the opinions of others, which is a healthier person. And it may be hard to hear this, but I'm not lying when I say that I say these things out of love. And I say them with a true hope that they will ultimately have a positive impact. You just have to take my word for it. Okay. Now, I haven't been part of the evangelical church for many years. It was like 6 or 7 years probably. But, before we told our stories, there was a lot of speculation about us that we might still be evangelical Christians, because there was lots of public evidence of that from our past. You could pull it up.
Cumulative,
and you could come to that conclusion. And the actions of white evangelicals in the year 2020 served as a strong confirmation for me personally to have publicly disassociated myself from the church. Now, again, I left because I came to what for me was an inescapable conclusion that the church had a spurious relationship with the truth. And I feel like that spurious relationship with the truth was borne out in 2020. But it's more than just a spurious relationship with the truth. I think the church demonstrated that it has a spurious relationship with justice as well. So on the issue of racial injustice, and I'm going to pull some data from the Public Religion Research Institute. This is all
shout out.
This is all straight from there. White Christians are nearly twice as likely as religiously unaffiliated whites to say the killings of black men by police are isolated incidents rather than part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans. White Christians are about 30 percentage points more likely to say monuments to Confederate soldiers are symbols of Southern pride rather than symbols of racism. White Christians are also about 20 percentage points more likely to disagree with the following statement. Generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that makes it difficult for blacks to work their way out of the lower class. Author Robert P. Jones, who's also associated with the PRRI, created a racism index that was generated using 15 questions designed to get beyond personal biases and include perceptions of structural injustice. So basically, this is a racism test. White evangelical Protestants had the highest median score on the racism index. As Jones summarized, while most white Christians think of themselves as people who have warm feelings toward African Americans, holding racist views is nonetheless positively and independently associated with white Christian identity. Having spent most of my life in the white evangelical church, I don't need these stats, but you might need them in order to understand that racism has a very comfortable home in the white evangelical church today. And also, newsflash, and people who know their history know that this is not new, right? It isn't like 2020 made the church racist. The white church has held up racist ideas and defended racist ideas and perpetuated racist ideas for hundreds of years. The church, now what we were told, what we grew up thinking is that, the only reason that slavery ended was because of the Christian abolitionists. But what that fails to account for is the only reason that slavery continued for so long was the white Protestants who were justifying it and doing it, right? And not only that, not only were they instrumental in the justification of slavery, the church was instrumental in the justification of segregation that followed slavery. And Sunday morning remains the most segregated time of the entire week in America. 2020 just pulled the curtain back. 2020 just pulled the curtain back on something that lots of people have known for a long time.
I will say, you kind of alluded to it. I'll just say, I'll refer to your Medium article, Letter to a White Man, because that's where you explored your own experience, and you wrote the letter to your former self. I think that, again, you made a statement earlier that, like, if given my experience and your experience growing up when we did where we did, including in the church, but just when and where we did in general as white guys. I know a lot of this rings true for me from personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
And being close to it to the point where I personally am sorry for being so close to it and unwittingly involved many times, more than I even care to reflect or completely understand, because it's scary to think about. But I talk to my kids about it,
Yeah.
So just wanted to throw that in there.
Well,
This rings true from my personal experience.
And the reason this is such a tricky thing is because as a white Christian, I didn't think that I had racist ideas. In fact, I felt I had been inoculated to racist ideas because I believed in a gospel that was for everyone. There was no slave. There was no free person. There was no man, no woman. There was no race. The gospel, it doesn't discriminate. And I thought that because that was true, therefore, racism can't really exist. But what I failed to see until I left was that so many racist ideas were not being challenged and actually were being perpetuated within our church in ways that we were blind to. But when we come back to 2020, as opposed to being on the front lines of calling for racial justice in America, white evangelicals reliably deny or minimize systemic racism. And they also point out the problems with racial justice protests rather than acknowledging the problems that are being protested, right? And this is what I talked about in my letter to a white man. What does the typical white evangelical Christian say about the protests? Violence is never the answer. Right. That's the first thing, and a lot of times the only thing they say. But okay, yeah, violence is not good. We don't want violence. Violence is not productive most of the time. But what are people upset about? Can we talk about that? No. Well, because that doesn't exist. That's what we heard from, again, if you're a white evangelical and you're like, well, I don't believe that. Well, a lot of people you go to church with do. Simply put, white evangelicals have been on the wrong side of the fight against racial injustice. Okay, what about COVID? Let's talk about COVID. Let me just stop and acknowledge that for many of you who are already down the rabbit hole, who subscribe to a Christian nationalism and have mixed, Trumpism and Jesusism together, nothing that I say is going to be compelling. In fact, and everything that I say is going to just confirm to you that I have completely departed from the truth and now live in a world of lies. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to the person who sits next to you in church who knows better. COVID. Despite clear evidence showing that mask wearing helps slow the spread of COVID, white evangelicals are the group least likely to wear a mask in public. Least likely. Throw a dart at a demographic in America, who's least likely to wear a mask? White evangelicals get that award. Although the COVID mortality numbers are within the range predicted by scientists at the start of the pandemic, and hospitals have been, as predicted, overwhelmed in many parts of the country, white evangelicals are the most likely demographic to deny the seriousness of the pandemic. White evangelicals are also much more likely than the average American to question the efficacy of vaccination in general, and more likely to believe false information about the COVID vaccine. All this is added up to being one of the key reasons that America has had such a tough time with COVID. In short, white evangelicals have been on the wrong side of the fight against COVID. I don't want to get into too many more details. I'm not trying to give you evidence and argue if you don't believe that COVID's a real deal and you don't believe in masks or whatever. I'm just saying that this is what is borne out in America. So in summary, white evangelicals largely, not all, but largely, and more than anyone else, represent an intersection of science denialism and racist ideas that have made them an impediment in the fight against both COVID and racial injustice. And instead of worrying about the poor and the black and the brown, who are more likely to suffer from both the pandemic and racial injustice, white evangelicals have been preoccupied with their own personal freedoms, spending more time and energy talking about their own persecution rather than those actually being persecuted. Sorry. I'm not exactly sure why I get emotional about it, but I think it's because I was such a part of it for so long.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I can see myself there. And so I don't, it hurts and it's embarrassing.
Yeah, there's a lot of shame.
Yeah. And and it's just not, oh, look at how righteous we are now. Look at how woke we are now. It's just not. I mean, it's like, because I'm not thinking about, when you say that, I end up thinking about my former self.
I'm talking to myself.
Yeah. And it's,
yeah. But perhaps the single issue that best captures white evangelicals' dubious relationship with truth and justice is their overwhelming allegiance to Donald Trump. Do I want to talk about Donald Trump? No, I do not. I'm so glad that I do not have to see him in the news cycle. You probably don't want to talk about him either, but we can't talk about 2020. We can't talk about white evangelicals. We can't talk about the last 4 years without talking about Donald Trump. By far, the most reliably supportive group for Donald Trump, holding steadily at around 8 out of 10. 8 out of 10. That's a lot. You tell me there's an 8 out of 10 chance it's going to rain today, I'm like, I'm bringing my umbrella. 8 out of 10 of white evangelicals supported Donald Trump. Both times around, 2016 and 2020. And I can think of few people, not just presidents, but just few people in general who are less Christ-like than Donald Trump. I mean, okay, right? I'm not being far-fetched. Yet he has enjoyed more evangelical support than even George W. Bush, who was actually an evangelical. Right? And let me just say, again, I hesitated putting this in there, but listen, I'm no longer a part of the church, but things could have fallen a little bit different, and I could still be in the church, right? If the multi-world theory of the parallel universe is true, there's billions of RHETT'S that are still in the church. Let me tell you what those billions of RHETT'S are saying right now.
Well, you're annoying them, that's for sure.
Well, no. The RHETT that is out there in a parallel universe who is still in the evangelical church would not have gone along with this Donald Trump bullshit. I can tell you that right now. And I lost so much respect for so many people who did. Now, for me, the most personally disturbing thing is the way that Christian talked about this before. Christian nationalism and Trumpism have kind of combined to create something that carries the name of Jesus. Literally, if you look at the Capitol protest, you see there's Trump 2020 flags and literally Jesus 2020 flags. I don't think he was running for president, but there's a flag that says Jesus 2020 right next to a Trump 2020 flag. Not uncommon at all to see that. But they've combined to create something that carries that name of Jesus, but looks nothing like the Jesus that I have seen in the Bible. Journalist Carol Kuruvia did a good job of contrasting the words of Jesus with those of Donald Trump. So I'm going to do that just quickly. Just take this in. Jesus said, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you. Donald Trump said, when people wrong you, go after those people because it is a good feeling and because other people will see you doing it. I always get even. Jesus said, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Donald Trump said, I'm putting people on notice that are coming from Syria as part of this mass migration, that if I win, they're going back. I could go on about other things he said that would contrast with that, but Jesus said, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Trump said, sorry, losers and haters, but my IQ is one of the highest, and you all know it. Please don't feel so stupid or insecure. It's not your fault.
Yeah, I'm not laughing
That's
anymore.
almost funny.
Yeah, but I'm not laughing anymore.
Jesus said, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Trump said, part of the beauty of me is that I'm very rich. Okay, she actually did a lot more. That's all I'm going to do. I could go on. Cheating on his pregnant wife with a porn star, then paying her off, bragging about grabbing women by the pussy, bragging about being able to shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and not lose any supporters. Again, none of this is new. You've heard it from so many people.
I would say, I'd be tempted to say, you know what, it's a little late for this, isn't it? And that's just the shocking thing, is that it's not. There's still so much, the allegiance is still there.
Right.
Now.
Yeah, the allegiance is still there. Now, listen, I know many evangelical Christians who recognize these quote-unquote flaws in Donald Trump, but they say that he stands for their interests and he stands against something that's worse than him, and therefore supporting him is justified, right? That's the position by many people. Now, personally, I find it hard to square Jesus' words to turn the other cheek with an almost obsessive insistence that civilians be able to carry an AR-15. I find it hard to square Jesus' words about feeding and clothing the hungry with separating children from their families at the border. I find it hard to square Jesus' words to the rich to sell their possessions with supporting tax policy that concentrates wealth in the top 1% and gives corporations the rights of individuals. I can't make those two things line up very well. But even then, there are still people who say, listen, look at what he did with the judges. He got 3 conservative judges on the Supreme Court. He got hundreds of federal judges appointed, good constitutional Christian conservatives, and therefore, all in all, he's done good, even if he's a bad, flawed person. Here's what I say to that. My friend William Matthews made an astute observation about this desire for Christians to have power, for their interests to be represented in the quote-unquote kingdoms of the world. In Matthew chapter 4, you may remember this story. After Jesus had fasted for 40 days, Satan took him to a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, and he said to him, All these things I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. Now, there's a lot to that story, but the idea is that Satan himself was saying that, like, where I exert my power is in the traditional kingdoms of the world. And he's asking Jesus, are you interested in exerting your power there? And that was the temptation that Jesus said no to. And it seems to me, when I look at white evangelicals in 2021, they have fallen to the temptation that Jesus himself resisted. Here's one way to see it. If you're a white evangelical in America in 2021, you're no longer represented by Jesus. You're represented by the My Pillow guy. I mean, that's what I would think. Because that's what I see. So again, so thankful that I was able to say that I'm not a part of this group heading into 2020. But I want to address another aspect of the story. One of the common responses to our story was a sense of like fear and panic that the two of us were leading kids astray, that these YouTubers who have this big audience that has a lot of kids in it are causing these crises of faith to happen all over the place, right? Mm-hmm. And that in turn led to a lot of people talking about how churches and parents need to do a better job to train and educate young Christians to protect them from people like me and you, right?
Yeah.
I have an alternative theory about why so many young people are leaving the church, because they are leaving the church like never before. I was going to say I'd like to take credit for it. But I'm not going to say. What I'm saying is I don't think it's because of me and you, and here's why. And I say this. I mean it. I say this out of love and respect, because I do believe that there is hope for the church. Your kids are not leaving the church because you didn't train them enough. Your kids are leaving the church because you trained them well enough to develop a sense for truth and justice. You let them read the words of Jesus. And they got it. And they've recognized that the church doesn't seem to be interested in those words. They're not leaving because they don't know the truth. They're leaving because they do. This isn't even necessarily something that they would articulate. This is something that is happening on a soul level. Because me and you didn't give we didn't give people new information that they never considered. There wasn't anything revolutionary. There wasn't anything even particularly insightful about what we had to say on our podcast. Honestly, nothing that we said was never, it all been said before. But I think the thing that we did is we demonstrated that it is okay to question. It is okay to question it all. Your kids were already questioning it because it's pretty questionable, okay? It is. And now they're seeing that leaving the church might not ruin your life. In fact, you might find a new life.
You know, when Lando was 9 years old, one of his favorite people on earth was his teacher from last year. And she's a lesbian. She has a wife. They have 2 kids. We went to Legoland, and we happened to run into them. This is before the pandemic hit. And it was, you know, I got a kick out of Lando seeing his teacher, who he loved so much, in a different environment, you know? It's that there's always that funny exchange between a student and their teacher out in the wild, and it feels weird. But his love for her was so strong that it had the power to overcome that weirdness. And like we got a picture together, and we would see each other in line, and we'd talk to each other, and like, you know, it was amazing. Just that he has that type of relationship with his teacher. If I would have instilled in him what was instilled in me, he would have not, he would have felt deep down within himself that he didn't have permission to love her. that was my experience, because, and I know that's, that's, you can pick that statement apart easily because, like, well, there's a difference
Love the
between
sinner, hate the sin.
yeah, but I know what the experience is like, and I know how I looked at people who weren't straight. But the thing is, and to your point, Lando knows. He knows what it's like to love somebody. That's not something that
It's inherent.
That's not something that I had to teach him. And the fact that he's free to love her is a beautiful thing
And to love her fully. I think
to love her fully.
that because
Yes.
when you love, because again, I'm not saying that there are Christians who believe, based on their commitment to the Bible and their interpretation of the Bible, that being gay is ultimately wrong. But they say that our gay acts are wrong, but the person is lovable and can be redeemed, etc. But the thing that
it just
mentality
doesn't work out that way
you can't
in your heart.
You're invalidating a huge part of that person's identity and existence, and also in your teacher's case, the relationship in her family is not a valid or a legitimate family, and therefore that's not full. It's just not full love.
And I didn't have to teach him that.
Yeah, right.
He knows what full, wholehearted, true love for somebody is. And I'll leave it at that. But
So if you want your kids to stay in the church, again, this is unsolicited advice. I don't know if anybody's taking it, but this is not a, hey, I want all your kids to leave the church. That's not what I'm saying at all. If you want your kids to stay in the church, you don't need to change your kids. You need to change your church. If your kids can't find Jesus, the Jesus that they know from the Bible, the Jesus that you've taught them about, if they can't find him within the walls of your church, you know what? They will go looking for him elsewhere. And that may not be what they say they're doing. That may not be how they articulate it. It may not be how they describe it, but I believe that that's what's happening. And it's interesting because, people made assumptions about me and you, and they're making the same assumptions about their kids. Let me explain. So a lot of people assume that we left the church because there was something out there, something outside of the church, whether that be fame, fortune, cultural acceptance, whatever, that we ultimately wanted more than Jesus, right? Like we fell to the temptation and we went after that thing instead of Jesus. And you also think that your kids might want something out there, something outside of the church more than they want Jesus. I think it might be simpler than that. I think maybe your kids who left the church just wanted Jesus, and they saw that you wanted something else. They see that the church at large seems to want something else. Because in my experience, in just looking at it, and again, regardless of your conclusions about the nature of the historicity of Jesus and the specific words that are in the Bible, but if you just take the words of Jesus, the life of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus at face value, you have to do some very athletic mental gymnastics to find a way to reconcile the way the white evangelical church looks in America today with any of those words. I just can't put those puzzle pieces together in a way that makes sense. Okay, I stepped into a giant pile of bull crap, and we'll see how that airs out on the internet. But let's move on.
okay.